All right, everybody, I want to pick up here with some miscellaneous coverages. That's the chapter in the textbook that talks about all these things. Excess and umbrella policies. Additional liability coverage is what that is. We'll talk about why that's necessary in just a little bit. Professional and management liability is another miscellaneous coverage that's worth talking about. Aircraft insurance, awfully specific. Coverage for foreign operations, also awfully specific. And then we get to surety bonds, which is an insurance type product, although it doesn't technically fit our definition of insurance. But it's still a big part of particularly the construction industry to understand how surety bonds work. So we'll get a chance to talk about all those coverages too in this particular unit, and then that'll set us up for property and liability loss control, control of risk. Right? So we're talking about how do we not do, so far up to this part, we've talked about insurance and policies and what's covered and what's excluded. We're going to shift gears a little bit in the tail end here with loss control, risk control, and say, okay, well, what things can we do besides insurance to try to reduce the frequency and severity of losses? So that's kind of an outline of where the rest of the unit is going. And I guess, scrolling through the slides, you could see that. Where we are right now is these miscellaneous coverages, starting with excess and umbrella coverages. So with liability, one of the problems that you have is that you can't easily estimate the worst case scenario. So maximum possible loss, MPL. All right, well, if I'm talking about a building, that's easy. What if I lost the building and I had to rebuild it? All right, that would cost $2 million. Boom, there you go. That's your maximum possible loss. That's the worst thing that could happen. And then usually we don't talk about risk in those terms because we're not looking for the absolute worst possible thing. We put that out on the fringe of the probability distribution. Instead, we're going to look at what we call the probable maximum loss. So the biggest loss that's actually likely. And it's interesting when companies actually try to project this stuff, a lot of times they'll use actuarial methods. And so they'll simulate 10,000 years of business operation. And then they'll just ignore the top 2.5% and the bottom 2.5% of the tail. So they're discarding the extreme 5% of values, saying, well, that's not likely. So we don't have to consider that, and we'll mark our probable maximum loss at the 97.5 percentile or the 95th percentile. That's great, but that's completely arbitrary. And it's important to realize that ignoring the tail risks, that's a really dangerous thing to do because it's those tail risks that are going to put you out of business. But with liability, there's no question. It's much harder to deal with the worst possible case scenario. So it makes sense to have a type of coverage that will sit above your standard layer of liability. A lot of CGL policies have aggregate limits of $2 million. And then remember, we've got our completed operations and products liability separate limit, usually also $2 million. That's really common. What if you need more than that? That's where we're going to get excess insurance to help us out. So there's limits in your CGL. And what if you need more coverage? That's what an excess policy is going to do. So excess, when we talk about excess coverage, it usually sits above just one policy, just your CGL, for example. If you're using an umbrella, that technically means it sits above multiple policies. So the liability can come from different directions at the same time. And it's usually CGL, auto liability, and employer liability that we're just sitting on top of all three of those. And then we're going to use this excess or umbrella policy. We're going to use that when we exceed our limits. Or also, if there is no underlying coverage that applies. It can happen where a loss is excluded in the CGL, but covered in the excess or covered in the umbrella. And now we have a situation where we're going to drop down and pick up that liability. But we don't have that $2 million shield because the loss isn't covered. So we're dropping down to pick that up. Drop down coverage is a term you're going to see. So excess liability most commonly is going to be what we call following form. And that means it copies the exclusions, it copies everything. When it's following form, it's an identical policy. The only thing that's different is that the limit is higher, and we're only going to use it when the underlying limits have been exceeded. If there's something that's not covered in the underlying, if it's following form, it's not covered in the excess either. So we don't have to worry about it there. It's possible to have the excess policy have its own terms. And now you do have this situation where the terms can be different, although we're still going to say that the loss has to be covered under both policies for it to be covered. And then we might do following form for part of the policy, and we might have separate conditions, maybe separate exclusions on the excess. We could do that. Or we could have separate conditions and exclusions on the underlying. So they could be different there. And then we have this question of, well, are we going to drop down and cover these things or not? With umbrella, again, the difference is they're sitting above multiple lines. So CGL, auto, employer's liability. That's typically what happens. Historically, the umbrella would cover more than the underlying policy would cover. And so because of that, you would occasionally have a situation where you'd have a loss that isn't covered by the underlying, but is covered by the umbrella. So they would have to drop down and pick up that coverage. Historically, that was the case. More recently, what started to happen is you buy an umbrella policy, there will be an endorsement that says we're following form. And what that means is we're not covering anything that the underlying isn't covering. And that's the biggest implication of using following form, is that we're not creating new coverages here. So in terms of, well, drop down, when does that happen? That happens when, okay, the ordinary situation that we expect, higher limits, right? We're above our $2 million aggregate. We need the umbrella or we need the excess. So yep, now we're going to fill in for the remainder of the coverage. Or less likely, when we have claims that are not covered by the underlying but are covered under the excess. Okay, well then we have to drop all the way down and cover from the first dollar. We might not cover exactly down to the first dollar because of that last item on the slide here. There will be a retention amount. We call this a self-insured retention. It only applies when the underlying coverage doesn't cover the loss, but the umbrella does. Then you're going to have to kick in part of that. And for small businesses, that amount can be as low as $500. It's a deductible. For bigger businesses, it might be more like $25,000 or $100,000. You pay the first $100,000 because your CGL isn't going to cover it. And then once you've paid that, we'll dip into your umbrella coverage. The other thing that can happen here is that actually, if you have an umbrella or an excess policy, is it can increase how much money you have available to fight your case. Because otherwise, when your limit is exhausted, then that's the end of the defense coverage too. If you have umbrella, well, that'll make it possible for you to have more money to fight your case, to be able to hire legal representation for your side. And that's something we'll spend a little bit more time talking about when we get to professional liability. So these coverages are going to stack when you have an umbrella. They are going to require that the underlying must have at least a certain limit. So it's real common for an umbrella to say, we'll use an umbrella, but you got to have at least $1 million CGL. We'll use an umbrella, you got to have at least a $2 million aggregate, and then also the $2 million aggregate for completed operations and product liability. So if you've got less than that, boost that first. Then we can start talking about offering you an umbrella. So if you had 1 million underlying and a 10 million umbrella, they stack. You would have a total of 11 million in total coverage limits. And it's going to be in addition to whatever self-insured retention is there. So you've chosen a deductible. In this example that's on the slide, you got a $5 million umbrella with 100,000 self-insured retention. First, you pay the first 100,000, and then beyond that, you have 5 million from the umbrella that'll kick in. But the first dollars are paid by your self-insured retention. Again, that's only going to happen if the underlying excludes it, but it's covered by the umbrella. And again, those situations are less common than they used to be. Then the umbrella, the last line on here, you probably can't quite read it. The umbrella will have aggregate limits too. So yeah, you can get a $10 million umbrella, and that's going to be an aggregate limit. So under no circumstances is that insurance company going to pay out more than a total of $10 million. And it'll be priced accordingly. The more coverage you want, the more expensive it's going to be. It's not going to be linear because those big lawsuits are unlikely. So you can For example, I can give you an example from our business. The propane liability, by law, you've got to have $1 million in coverage for propane liability if you want to run a propane business in the state of Minnesota. That's the minimum limit. Okay, so we got that. That I wanted to say cost about $10,000. But we could get a $5 million umbrella to sit on top for about $7 million. $7,000. So 10,000 for the first million, but the next 5 million would have only been 7,000. So you can kind of see that per unit, it gets cheaper the higher you go. That's because a $1 million liability lawsuit, if we have to use that coverage, we're going to be in that layer. But there's a good chance we won't use the next layer of 2 million or 3 million or 4 million or all the way up to 5. That's extremely unusual. Now you're pretty much limited to cases that actually result in death where fault is clear. And fortunately, nothing like that ever came up. I'm starting to realize that for as long as I was involved with the business, it's amazing we never got sued. Not during my time there, not during my father's time there, not during my grandfather's time there. We never got sued. That's amazing. If you run a business, that's a cost to doing business. At some point, you're going to get sued. And even if you haven't done anything wrong, you have to pay the defense costs. So liability insurance, for that reason alone, is worth having, just for that, to be able to have professionals defending you who know what they're doing. And then you don't have to go out and find your own lawyers and tremble every time that they're sending you a bill every month showing you the hourlies that the hourly work that they spent on your project at $400 an hour. It's a frustrating thing when you see that somebody made a 10-minute phone call and they hit you with an $80 charge. And you say, wait a minute, wow, that's for 10 minutes, really? Yeah. You better have your questions, before you call your lawyer, have your questions written out. You do not want to waste time on the phone with your lawyer. That's expensive time. Okay, so those are some features of the umbrella. It's possible to make the coverage even narrower. You could add some exclusions. A lot of times that happens with lead poisoning. That's a real good example of places where umbrellas will say, look, if you got a lead exposure, that's possibly a tremendous loss. We just don't have a way to cover that. We're going to have to exclude that. Or there's another place where we could make the coverage broader than the underlying, and watercraft length is a common exclusion there. 26 feet seems to be the watercraft line. If something is bigger than 26 feet, it's generally going to be excluded in the standard policy, but it might be covered in your umbrella policy. Again, you're talking about business. What kind of business would have a boat? We're very specific now. You need a broker to help you work these things out. When you look at the conditions, the biggest condition, they're going to say, yeah, you got to keep your underlying coverage. Okay, you can't let that lapse, and then all of a sudden all you have is no underlying, but the umbrella is still in force. That's not a good situation for them. They were assuming, and they priced based on the idea that you've got the underlying of the first million or the first 2 million. And if you don't, whoa, they've got to reprice, and it's going to be pretty dramatic. That's the most expensive layer that has to be added back in. If your policy is going to change, then they need the excess, and the umbrella needs to know how's it going to change. One thing that helps with this is if you can align the coverage periods. So you don't want, your underlying to go from January 1 to December 31st, and then your excess to go from July 1 to June 30th. That creates the potential for some friction there where you make a change on January 1 and you're in the middle of your umbrella policy. So aligning that is a really smart decision. It's just one less headache in case something changes. And remember, you're busy. You're trying to run your business. You don't have time to maintain and look around and try to figure out how did your insurance policy change. This might be a 30-page document. How do you tell what changed? You're relying on your broker. One thing that helps is if everything comes due at the same time, then we can adapt and we can react. Okay, so that's umbrella and excess. That's sitting on top of your CGL. And if it's umbrella, it's sitting on top of multiple lines, probably CGL, auto, and employer's liability. Now I want to shift gears and talk about professional and management liability. So this is a very specific kind of liability. It comes from failing to render professional services. So not all businesses are going to have this exposure. Physicians are going to have it, and they know all about it. If you know anybody who's a physician, Ask them about medical malpractice insurance, and I promise you, you will get an earful. Attorneys, absolutely, they're held to a higher standard. They're supposed to know the law. They're supposed to know what's going on. If they give bad advice, that's a liability exposure. Engineers are supposed to know how to build bridges. If they screw something else, they're up. There's a liability exposure there. Dentists, tax professionals, anybody who's expected to have a higher degree of expertise than usual has a professional liability exposure, and it's usually going to be excluded by their CGL, by endorsement. So usually what happens is you write a CGL, and one of the CGL endorsements is going to say, hey, we don't cover professional liability. Anything that comes from failing to render professional service, we don't cover that. You're going to need a professional liability insurance policy. So it's going to cover things like errors and omissions or malpractice. So an insurance agent, this happens all the time. You've got somebody who gets sued, and they're sued for a higher limit than the coverage they have. And they come back to the agent. They said, why didn't you tell me this was possible and recommend more coverage? I'm going to sue you for errors and omissions, for malpractice. You should have advised me to buy more coverage. This is why you'll never get an insurance agent to give you a solid answer when you say how much liability coverage is enough. They'll say, how much can you afford? How much do you think is enough? They want you to make that decision, because if they say 2 million is enough and it turns out that it isn't, they have a professional liability exposure. You can come back and sue them and say, hey, you promised me 2 million was going to be enough and it wasn't. I want you to pay now. That's a possibility. So that's part of the way to deal with that is to buy professional liability insurance. Another way is to use loss control, and don't ever pin yourself down on a recommendation for how much is going to be enough. Because that's literally not predictable. It's a bad idea to try to guarantee somebody that a certain amount is going to be enough on liability. You can't promise that. With management liability, we have a bunch of different categories. We've got directors and officers liability. So, okay, the directors and officers make decisions on behalf of the shareholders. What if the directors and officers make a set of decisions that benefits them and hurts the shareholders? If the shareholders think they've been wronged, they can sue management. And that's called D&O liability. That's a specific line that handles that, directors and officers liability. We've got employee benefits liability. We've got employment practices liability, and claims can come from both directions there. But management is going to be sued. Somebody claims that a coworker is creating a hostile working environment and you didn't respond. Yep, you're probably going to be liable for failing to respond to a right that the worker has to expect that they're going to be able to work in an environment that's free from hostile influences, whatever that might be. This is a vicarious liability kind of thing. I didn't do it, but it was one of my employees mistreating another employee, and I can be held liable for that, depending on the actions that I take. Again, the standard is always what does a reasonable person do? So as long as I behave as a reasonable person, what a jury would say, yeah, that's what a reasonable person would do, that helps in my defense. Sometimes we have fiduciary liability, and that means we expect more, usually in matters that are dealing with money. So we have to make sure that we're always acting in the best interest of the person whose money it is. And if it can be shown that I did something else that was in my interest and not necessarily in the shareholder's interest, that could be a fiduciary liability exposure, and that's a separate line. So a lot of this is going to be business particular. You got a small business, you don't really have to worry about directors and officers liability because there's a good chance that the shareholders are the directors and officers. So there is no conflict, and you don't have to worry about one group trying to sue another. In a really small business, that's probably not going to exist. But where you have separate shareholders from management, well, then they do have a duty to behave in the best interest of the shareholders. And if the shareholders disagree, well, then we're going to fight that out in court. So there's not an exclusion in the CGL, but there's usually an endorsement that's attached that excludes professional liability. And sometimes these losses aren't bodily injury or property damage or personal injury. Sometimes they come from some other direction. And because of that, if you're relying on your CGL, even if it doesn't have an exclusion, depending on the type of loss, you might not have coverage. because the CGL is only going to cover things that fit under their definition of bodily injury, property damage, or personal injury. And so that's something that you have to concern yourself about. There's some differences that show up between the CGL and the professional management liability type of exposure. That's a good place to stop, though. I'll pick up here on this slide on the next lecture. Thanks a lot, you guys. Questions, email, like always. We'll go from there. Thanks.